It was on that day that cars stopped driving on the left-hand side of the road and started driving on the right-hand side of the road. They made the change in order to align with the Scandinavian neighbors. The morning of the change, it was reported, all non-essential traffic was banned from the roads, in some places from 10 a.m. that Saturday until 3 p.m. on Sunday. Any vehicles that were on the road had to come to a complete stop before 5 a.m. and were then guided to the right-hand side of the road to stop again before they were allowed to proceed. I think this is an example of a dramatic and immediate about-face, if you'll pardon the pun. Most policies change the world much more slowly. Next Tuesday evening, the faculties of Law, Management, Arts, and Social Science will be hosting a panel on the legalization of cannabis. The new law has opened up a number of challenging questions about distribution. Governments across the country will be working on these issues for some time to come. Health and safety concerns, business opportunities, what constitutes an appropriate regulatory response, and public attitudes towards these issues are all aspects of the pending change and will be discussed at next Tuesday's panel. As the July 1st date approaches, a sense of urgency will take over government departments. Yet while many will talk about July as a game changer, the truth is the world of policy is often pretty slow going. It takes time for systems to change, for attitudes to change, and for people to change their behavior. It will take some time to assess the real and lasting impact of legalizing cannabis. Maybe someone sitting in the class today will be standing in my shoes 20 years from now, talking about the real and lasting impact of legalizing cannabis in 2018. And this brings us to today's talk. When I was the same age as many people in the MPA policy class, tobacco was the top-of-mind issue, and many of us were concerned less with liberating its distribution and more about limiting its distribution. This week we take time in light of the 20th anniversary of the passage of the Tobacco Act to reflect on the process and the significance of the legislation as well as its impact. It falls under the MacEachen Institute's research theme of health systems and governance. No one is better placed to lead this discussion about the legislation than the person who was responsible for its passage, the Honourable David Dingwall. David Dingwall was a Member of Parliament for 17 years, from 1980 to 1997 for Cape Breton, East Richmond. He held a number of senior government portfolios. As the Minister of Health, he introduced the landmark Tobacco Act in 1997, a major achievement that is recognized by the World Health Organization and the Canadian Lung Association. David Dingwall currently serves as Chairman and CEO of the Darius Group and is a distinguished visiting professor at the Ted Rogers School of Business at Ryerson University. In 2016, Mr. Dingwall published a book, Negotiating So Everyone Wins. In it, he draws on his expertise on negotiating and deal-making in politics and industry. We'll be discussing this book in more detail in the roundtable with second-year graduate students that Darrell Dexter will chair later this afternoon. Finally, I'll add that when I saw Mr. Dingwall a week ago Sunday at the Celebration of Life for Mr. MacEachen, he said he learned many negotiating strategies and tricks from his mentor, Mr. MacEachen. And so in addition to talking about the Tobacco Act, he will also offer some reflections on Mr. MacEachen's impact and influence. I'm sure it will be a very stimulating discussion. Mr. Dingwall will speak for about 45 minutes, and then he will take questions from the floor. David.
This is my first time at public speaking, so bear with me. You know, the MacEachen Institute is a pretty impressive operation. They gave me a cup of coffee and a muffin, and they told me that if my remarks were not well received, lunch is on your own. Nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here and to say a few words with regards to tobacco legislation, but also to say a few words about a person who I have loved dearly for many years. Allan J., as he was known, was my colleague, he was my mentor, and he was my friend. I served with him for over 16 years in the Parliament of Canada. His style was graceful, his manner was collaborative, but don't let that fool you. He possessed a steely toughness that could not be shaken. His value of serving the public good still resonates with many Canadians and particularly Nova Scotians. He believed in the public good and he practiced the public good. In fact, I believe he was the master of his generation for the last 50 years. MacEachen served in many different governments, the Saint Laurent, the Pearson, the Trudeau, and yes, Mr. Turner. And as you'll all know, he served in some of the most senior portfolios from finance to foreign affairs, government host leader, labor, health, and a host of others. Perhaps his shining achievement was the Medicare Act of 1966. And I tie that in with my own tobacco legislation and the role that Allan J. played in shaping that legislation. But 1966, Medicare was passed. It became the envy of the world. In fact, when you go back today to the World Health Organization, the Canadian Minister of Health is visited by numerous ministers of the Crown from all over the world, wanting to know about Medicare, its implications, its impact, and how was it done. When I was at the World Health Organization in 1996, those sentiments were expressed clearly and unequivocally. In fact, I had a private meeting with the ministers of health from Latin American countries, and they wanted to talk about Medicare, and then they wanted to talk about tobacco. The Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors, the Canada Labour Code, the Canada Pension, a host of other legislation that he steered through the House of Commons. And done, my friends, as I'm sure the former Premier of Nova Scotia, Darrell Dexter, would, as I am, marvel at, done in a minority parliament. Pretty significant. And of course, on the international stage, he served Canada very well in terms of the 200-mile fishing zone, which he quarterbacked through the United Nations. I'm often asked, and I want to share with you the following question and answer. What qualities did Mr. MacEachen have to achieve such great success? Perhaps one could talk about his values, the public good, but it was also his civility, his ability to listen. And sometimes those of us who would go to him with various scenarios, there would be long pauses on his end. And of course, it made you talk more and more. And sometimes you would defeat your own argument before you even made a substantive argument. But he was a superb listener. He was a consummate prober. And his manners were impeccable. No one could ever say, after meeting with Allan J., that it wasn't interesting, that he was dismissive. That would never happen. So those qualities did him very well with a variety of stakeholders. And those of you who are interested in the public policy process, I flash this amber light to you. Those kinds of qualities are essential in dealing with the public service at every level, with stakeholders that are for you and stakeholders that are against you. And of course, they're very important in terms of the political structure that you have before you, your own party and the political parties that are opposite. So for me, Allan J. has been a mentor and a friend, and I shall miss him, and I shall miss him greatly. On the issue of tobacco, just think back, 1987. Most of you weren't born. I attended a fire hall annual meeting in Dominion, Cape Breton. And with me on this particular occasion, It was the installation of officers for the fire department. Fire department. Fire department. My wife was with me, and she was coughing continuously. And the reason why is that blue smoke filled the entire fire hall. Thank God that the fire alarm went. And all the firemen in their nice new uniforms had to rush out to go for a fire, but they had to lift up the doors, and then all the smoke left. And who would have thought that 10 years later, I, as a member of Parliament and as a member of Cabinet, would have the opportunity to deal with the tobacco consumption in Canada in a meaningful way. A few facts. 1971, the federal government introduced a bill to restrict tobacco advertising. The House of Commons was prorogued, therefore the bill didn't go anywhere. 15 years go by. In 1986, a private member's bill was introduced entitled Smoke-Free Workplaces in Areas Under Federal Jurisdiction. That was done by my colleague, who happened to be a member of Parliament from the New Democratic Party, but she received the full support of the House. In 1988, the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney, under the leadership of Jake Epp, put before the House, after extensive consultations, the Tobacco Products Act of 1988. In 1991, two declarations were sought from the Quebec Superior Court. The declarations were that the Tobacco Products Control Act was ultra-virus to the Parliament of Canada and invalid by Section 2B of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. The justice at that time of the Quebec Superior Court found that the Tobacco Control Act of 1988, invalid in its entirety, both as being ultra-virus to the Parliament of Canada under the Constitution Act of 1867, and also constituting an unjustifiable infringement of Section 2B of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Wow. It was immediately appealed to the Quebec Court of Appeal. And this is where some of the problems and the challenges that I had to deal with as a Minister of Health. The Court of Appeal allowed the appeals from Justice Chabot and upheld the constitutional validity of the Act in its entirety. It was unanimous in deciding that the Act was not beyond the legislative competence of Parliament under Section 91 of the Constitution Act, and although the Attorney General had conceded the Act constituted an infringement of the appellant's right under Section 2B of the Charter, a majority of the justices said it was justified to do this under the provisions of Section 1 of the Charter. Health Canada, much to my regret, looked upon that decision as conclusive evidence that tobacco control legislation was going to be solid for Canada to move forward. Little did we know the bombshell of 1995, and it was a bombshell. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled in a 6-3 decision that the Tobacco Products Control Act of 1988 was unconstitutional. That was in November. I was appointed Minister of Health in January of 1996. Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister. But as Canada's Minister of Health, I've had several issues to deal with. Some of them you may be familiar with. But there was a tainted blood scandal which was seizing the country. There was the whole issue of providing drugs at a reasonable cost to people with AIDS. There was the crushing demands of our Aboriginal peoples whose health conditions were deplorable. And then tied in with that was the federal-provincial fight as it relates to the social transfer. So I was in the midst of those issues along with a tobacco issue. There was one other issue, and if you want to talk about it later, I can, but I was also seized in the midst of my term as Minister of Health with an issue on cheese, where my officials, without informing the minister, which was the protocol, decided to inform the country that cheese in Quebec was tainted. And I got blindsided by this particular announcement, and of course had to drop everything to try to deal with the cheese crisis, including a Quebec group of ministers and a prime minister from Quebec wanting to know what the hell was going on with cheese. As I said earlier, the Federal Department of Health was not really ready for the 1995 decision. The department had believed that the Court of Appeal in Quebec was sufficiently strong and that Canada was in good shape. We had a very small team in 1996. People had left the department. It was a ragtag team of officials, not much cohesiveness, not much forethought in terms of the next steps in trying to address the situation of the Supreme Court of Canada. They did, however, in fairness, they did release a consultation paper, and the consultation paper went about to various stakeholders. It bought the Government of Canada, as I'm sure the former Premier would recognize, about 4 weeks. And then all hell broke loose. The health groups were just so livid that we were not ready for this eventuality in terms of putting a new piece of legislation before the people of Canada. They were livid that I was going to embark upon a pretty rigorous consultation process across the country, while Big Tobacco sat back in their chairs and very quietly, very strategically told all of the players at the federal level, particularly ministers of the Crown, that there's no tobacco legislation needed. It would be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because, look, it was a 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court. I don't want to bore the hell out of you, but I think you have to understand some of the color of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision as it relates to tobacco. As I said, the majority decision was 6-3 in favor of finding the law unconstitutional. Beverly McLaughlin, who was not the Chief Justice at the time, wrote the opinion for the majority. And she took the lead in claiming that the Tobacco Products Act was unconstitutional. She held that the prohibition on advertising and promotion of tobacco products constitutes a violation of the right to freedom of expression under Section 2B of the Charter. She took the view that Section 9 of that Act requires tobacco manufacturers to place an unattributed health warning on tobacco packages. That, too, infringes the right of freedom of expression. And then she said the following. The infringements of the right of freedom of expression under Section 2B of the Charter are important. Furthermore, the Attorney General of Canada has failed to establish justifications under Section 1 of the Charter. That was a pretty substantive missile which was sent to the Department of Justice and the Department of Health. And then she concluded Sections 4, 8, and 9 of the Tobacco Products Control Act are unconstitutional. Pretty significant. Justice McLaughlin said that the first requirement is that there is a rational connection between the objective of reducing tobacco consumption and the advertising ban. She concluded that the trial judge was correct in that the totality of scientific documents in the state's possession in Canada's possession at the time the Act was passed do not demonstrate that a ban on advertising would affect the consumption of Canadians. The trial judge in Quebec observed that the Attorney General had adduced no evidence that a complete ban would reduce tobacco consumption more than a partial ban, or that the unattributed health warnings would be more effective than the attributed health warnings. As a result, he found that the Attorney General had failed to meet the burden upon him, which Justice McLaughlin agreed with. These were all signals to us at the Department of Justice and Health that we had to tailor any new legislation which would take that into consideration. There was another key finding of the Supreme Court, particularly on the majority side. It was noted that the Government of Canada carried out at least one study of the alternatives to a total ban of advertising before enacting the total ban. The Government of Canada had deprived the courts of the results of this study, which means that the Attorney General would not lay the document at the Superior Court level in the province of Quebec to justify what he was attempting to do. The Attorney General of Canada refused to disclose this document, and it was demanded at the trial, and he invoked provisions section 39 of the Canada Evidence Act. The tobacco companies, and by the way, some of you may ask questions as we get to the Q&A, but the tobacco companies were a very sophisticated group of men and women. They had an organization that was funded to the utmost. They had dozens upon dozens of individuals who were lobbyists working on their behalf, and they had some pretty smart, sharp lawyers on their team. They argued that the undisclosed alternatives to complete a ban was something that could not be tolerated. Unfortunately, the Attorney General's factum offered no response to the questions put forward by the tobacco companies. Instead, the Attorney General contented himself with the bland statement that a complete ban is justified because Parliament had to balance competing interests somehow. This fact was very detrimental to the Government of Canada's position. So that was the majority decision. We took some homage, if you will, from what the dissenting judges had said. And there was three: Justice LaForest, Justice Dubé, and Justice Gontier. And they were, I'll just read one paragraph from their decision, not wanting to get into too much of the detail. And they said, and I quote, "It is clear that Parliament could, if it chooses, validly prohibit the manufacturing sale of tobacco products under the criminal law power on the ground that these products constitute a danger to public health. Such a prohibition would be directly analogous to the prohibition on dangerous drugs and unsanitary food or poisons mentioned earlier, which quite clearly fall within the federal criminal law power." Three tobacco companies: R.J. McDonald, Imperial Tobacco, Rothmans, Benson, and Hedges. Just as an aside, if you think that there was no economic interest being at play here. Imperial Tobacco had made the previous year, after operations, $432 million in tobacco. So this little bald-headed guy from Cape Breton, he was not going to be very well liked by the economic interest which were at play. Second fact, when you know you're in the big leagues, R.J. McDonald and Imperial Tobacco, never mind Rothmans, Bensons, and Hedges, they spent, over a 10-year period, $750 million on advertising. That's pretty significant. We were able to find out through the auspices of that process of the majority and the minority, as well as all of the documents that followed along from the lower court to the appeal court to the Supreme Court of Canada, that the internal tobacco marketing document stated, and I quote, "The tobacco companies are concerned about our shrinking tobacco market, recognize that an advocacy thrust is necessary to maintain the size of the overall market. The companies understand that in order to maintain the overall numbers of smokers, they must reassure current smokers and make their product attractive to the young and to non-smokers." So, that's the legislation. That's dissecting the legislation. What do we do? We had 4 pillars to our plan as it relates to tobacco control. First of all was tobacco tax increases. Second was the anti-smuggling measures. And I had to work very closely with the RCMP, particularly the Commissioner's office, to make sure that we were able to get those measures down. And then, of course, education programs, and finally, the new Tobacco Act. So here I am a minister for a month or so, having all of these issues hit me, and I decided that I would avail myself of the expertise of Allan J. MacEachen. So some of you who may know the Ottawa scene, we went to Café André Burger, which is a pretty upscale restaurant in Hull. We got a private room, and we had a meal, and we had a discussion. So Mr. MacEachen, with all of his experience, was kind of humorous that night. And I think he may even brought along a package of cigarettes. He didn't smoke, but he brought them along anyway. So there we were in this private room, just the 2 of us, and he gave me 3 pieces of advice. And he said, "David, there are major, powerful economic interests at play here. You need to do your homework extremely well, and you need to watch your back. They will do everything to undermine you at every step of the way. The first thing that they will do is that they will discredit you in the eyes of your cabinet colleagues, and in particular the Prime Minister." They must have saw this, because that's exactly what they did. The health groups, he said, we will be vigilant in a new law, and they will test and challenge you every step of the way. For the most part, the health groups were very supportive, but what they wouldn't accept is the time frame that we wanted to put the new legislation in place. They wanted it yesterday. We were months away in terms of testing the provisions of the Act. With the Department of Justice, I hired 3 outside firms to take a look at our legislation to make sure it was constitutional. Second thing he said, consult broadly. That means Provincial Minister of Health, all the stakeholders, those that are for you, those that are against you, opposition parties, regardless of how big they are, because we had the Reform, we had the Conservative, and we had the NDP. And he said, don't forget the Senate of Canada either. The third thing that he shared with me, he said, is be certain that you work very closely with the chairman of the Standing Committee on Health. And I said, I always called him Minister. I said, well, Minister, why? Well, and I can hear his voice, and I mimic him from time to time, but I won't do that today. He said, you have to be strategic, David. Well, I said, I think I am being strategic. Well, he said, they could delay it at committee. This is now mid-1996. The election could be held early in 1997. And if they can delay it at committee, they can delay it elsewhere. So you've got to be very careful and very prudent that your chairperson understands what is taking place. So you have to make certain that you brief him on a daily, not a daily basis, but certainly on a weekly basis as to what is transpiring. And sure enough, there was a move afoot that went behind my back to the Prime Minister and said, you know, we're going too fast here. We need more consultation. We need more consultation. We need more consultation. So those three gems that MacEachen gave me at the Cafe Andre Burger was worth the weight of that very expensive dinner that we had, although I don't think he had any wine and I don't think he had any dessert either. So what comes along but Bill C-71? Bill C-71 stood the test of going to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it was found to be constitutional, it was found to be reasonable, it was found to be within the ambit of the Charter as well as the criminal law provisions. We changed in Bill C-71 the definition of manufacturing. The purpose of the bill was to be a focus on young people. Addictive ingredients were prohibited and placed in the schedule of the bill. And let me tell you this is a little thing that we picked up in the United States. We worked very closely with Donna Shalala, who was Secretary of Health under the Clinton administration. Nicotine. You change the provisions of nicotine just by, as they would say in Newfoundland, a smudging, boy, a smudging. You change that a bit. A young person, 13 or 14 years of age, bang, hooked for life. So we put all of those measures into regulations, statutory obligations on the part of the manufacturer that they shall submit this information to the minister. They went absolutely crazy. The regulations were wide and deep. For instance, tobacco products, access, labeling, promotion, packaging, sales promotion, and enforcement all had in the Act a set of regulations. I mean, I've never heard so much vulgarity coming from seasoned people on the other side. They thought it was despicable that we would go that deep. And of course, the Standing Committee would be reviewing those provisions. The Act, here's what it did. Photographic identification had to be produced by a consumer or the seller would be fined. Vending machine sales, gone. Health information on packages, compulsory. Magazine advertising, abolished. Billboards, gone. Buses, just keep track of this. Buses, gone. Sides of buildings, gone. Gas stations, gone. Airports, gone. Clocks, gone. Sports stadiums, gone. Countertop delays, gone. Ads on floors, gone. Life-size cutouts of sports celebrities, gone. Broadcasting, abolished. Baseball hats, gone. Backpacks, ashtrays, matches, logos on youth products, all gone. Next, my bill, before it's released, has to go to Cabinet. Cabinet Committee. I'm not sure where everybody sits at Cabinet Committee. And in fact, the Chancellor of Dalhousie University chaired that committee. So we did something which has not been done for a long, long time. I had a friendship with the Clerk of the Privy Council. And I said to the Clerk of the Privy Council, what would happen if I did a little bit of sizzle in the cabinet room? And she says, well, what do you mean by sizzle? Well, I said, I don't really know, but I said, well, I think we're going to have a 3 or 4 minute little video. Well, she said, that would be fine. You could do that. And I said, you know, our cabinet document has gone forward, but I'd like to leave them with a leave behind document. Well, you can do that. And I said, there's probably some other things that I don't remember that we might want to do. I'll never forget this. It was a Tuesday morning. Kenzie McKinnon will know that's when Cabinet met. Wednesday was caucus. So we met on Tuesday morning, the Cabinet Committee. on every seat of every minister was a baseball hat. There were billboards in the room. There was clocks. There was countertop displays. There was ads on the floor. There were life-size cutouts, broadcasting, baseball hats, backpacks, ashtrays, matches, and logos on a bunch of paraphernalia. It was coded. Well, I thought the clerk of the committee was going to go crazy because that's not allowed. Not supposed to do that. So I'd rather commit the sin and ask for forgiveness later. We had the video and we had the hard copy that we're going to leave behind. But it was so demonstrable that ministers did this. Oh my God, this is unreal. And I said to one of the ministers, whose name will remain nameless, because I didn't think he was in favor of the tobacco legislation, I said, this is what your daughter has to confront at every step of the way, is the proliferation of what big tobacco is doing to young people in this country. And all our polling data said that. Young people were smoking. Guys thought if they were having a cigarette, they'd be a lot tougher and more attractive to women. Young girls who were smoking thought it would make them sexier because they wouldn't put on any weight. That's the polling data in Canada, and that's the polling data in the United States. So it was a pervasive shot at my cabinet, call it. Anyway, long and behold, they approved my legislation at cabinet committee. After cabinet committee, you have to go to full cabinet. And of course, the Prime Minister is in the chair, and the document is spoken to for a few minutes by me. And I learned with Mr. MacEachen, the less spoken, the better. So I said, everybody supports it, sir. And the bill went through. Passed cabinet. And then something happened. I get a phone call. I can't tell you who it's from, okay? I can't tell you who it's from. But this is the way the phone call went. Hey, Ding, I want you to meet with Mr. Pelche. I want you to meet with Andre. I want you to meet with Herb. I want you to take a look at this legislation. Well, to say that I was intimidated, to say that I was nervous, I was very, very nervous. Because we were on the threshold of calling a federal election in 1997. So we had the meeting, and Mr. Pelche, who was the chief of staff and a dear friend of mine, who's passed away, we locked horns. It didn't kill our friendship, but it certainly ruptured it for a period of time. So he said when he was leaving the room after slamming his books on the table, "You're not going to move one goddamn bit, are you?" And I said, "You're goddamn well right." The bill goes to the House of Commons. First reading, second reading. And this is where friends come into play. The Reform Party, who disliked everything about the Liberal government and what we stood for. Their spokesperson, and I give him full credit, was Grant Hill. He allowed the Bloc to go first when they were the official opposition, which is unusual. He allowed the New Democratic Party to go first after him, and then he spoke third for the opposition. And he moved the motion, which essentially terminated the debate on second reading, and then it would move to committee. Now, I don't know why he did that, but for this particular reason, I thank him for it, because it helped to expedite the process. It went through committee. There was some suggestions, some alterations of amendments which were accepted. It went to report stage. It passed at report stage, and then, of course, it passed the House of Commons. It had some challenges and difficulties in the Senate because one or two senators were not happy with the provisions, but it passed almost unanimously in both institutions. Even though the bloc were opposed to it because of what the tobacco industry was doing for the arts and cultural industries across the country. So that is the passage of the Tobacco Act. One thing that I think is relevant for the tobacco legislation of 1997, I think, and I'll close with this, I think it's important that when you're trying to achieve good public policy, probably 5 or 6 things. The first thing is when you want to have good public policy, you need an unshakable resolve. 2 is you need to be patient. And 3, you need timely and good quality information, and you have to go where the information is, regardless of the source. Fourthly, I think you need an engaging leader, a salesperson, if you will. You need some grit. And if there's one thing that I think that the tobacco legislation of 1997 has done, yes, it has reduced tobacco consumption dramatically in this country over the last 20 years, and I'm very happy about that. But the most important thing for me as the former Minister of Health, it crushed the coolness of smoking. 20 years ago, you could go into someone's home, you could light up a cigarette. Thank you very much. You would never, ever, ever do that today in 2017, 2018. That coolness factor is gone. And I pay tribute to the Secretary of Health in the United States who assisted us with our legislation. I pay tribute to the World Health Organization for the previous resolutions that they had passed, which assisted us in terms of formulating our legislation. I see I've spoken for 45 minutes, as instructed. That's the Tobacco Act. Thank you. Do you want me to sit here?
If you wouldn't mind, that would be super. Thank you.
So sit down, okay. All right.
Thanks so much. That was great. Now, I've mentioned to Mr. Dingwall before the session that we have a few students who have prepared questions, and we'll be calling on those students to ask their questions, and we'll also open it up to the floor for anyone who might also want to put a question forward. But we'll start with one of the students, and why don't we start with Jennifer Mullane, who's sitting to the right. Jennifer, go ahead. Actually, wait, Jennifer, for the microphone, please. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that. I guess my question, 20 years later, and you mentioned some factors of success. The coolness factor's gone, dramatic reduction of smoking across Canada. Is that what you had imagined in 1996 and 1997? Did you have, thoughts 20 years out about what Canada would look like in terms of tobacco consumption, or was it more of a we've got to make it through the next few years and these are the first steps?
I had believed, because of discussions that I have had internationally on the tobacco, because it was growing at a rapid rate, that by getting rid of the advertising, that it would assist us enormously. But I think some of the other steps that we included in the Act, in terms of the regulation, the ingredients of the cigarette, controlling the quantities of the nicotine, testing that nicotine provisions, I think that helped measurably in terms of achieving our particular goals. I wish we could do more in terms of a next stage to assist those Canadians who religiously are trying to get off tobacco. That would be in your 50, 55, 65-year-olds who are trying to get off the cigarette. And I think more education is probably needed. It needs to be a consistent message to those individuals. But the fact that many of their kids don't smoke has helped in terms of you don't see too many adults with kids smoking in their own homes. As an aside, in China, and I go to China fairly often, one of the things that is admired in China is I always tell my guests, they always know, that I'm a former Minister of Health and I don't like when they smoke in these rooms. Now, the men and women are around these tables are not overly happy about that. But the people that sit in the back rows are young people like yourself. They're there because they know what smoking does in terms of your clothes, your hair, your health. They don't want to go that route. So to answer your question, yes, I thought it would have an effect, but probably it's been more successful than I had thought. I hope that answers.
Kenner Power.
Hi. So I have a question actually regarding alcohol.
Alcohol?
Yeah, alcohol.
Did you bring any?
I didn't. But although it has
Is that why you're asking the question?
No, actually. Completely the opposite reason. Although alcohol has been associated with numerous health risks, including various types of cancer, the industry lacks any sort of limits on, or some limits on advertising, and lacks the same kind of labeling that tobacco has. Obviously, there is less evidence associating it with chronic disease and stuff, but it still presents a huge cost on our public healthcare system. So I was wondering, why do you think there hasn't been any movement in that direction? And if you were involved in politics, would you support that kind of legislation?
Well, that's a hypothetical question, but I'll try to answer it. We had some bad experiments with alcohol in terms of the prohibition, in terms of what took place. The proliferation of organized crime, as we see with the marijuana stuff, proliferation of organized crime, the quality of the substance. People were, way back in the day, putting ingredients into some alcohol things which were obviously health-related, if not devastating. So prohibition didn't work. There has been, I think, a continuous watch of the alcohol file by the Standing Committee on Health and Welfare. It hasn't come forward with any substantive proposals in recent years, other than the significant advertising that they do in terms of responsible drinking, which I think is encouraging. Could they do more? Yes. Is there an effect on our healthcare system? I think you're right. I think there is a substantive effect on our healthcare system. I'm not sure at this point in time the best methods to do that. Tobacco was fatal in terms of the diseases that it would cause. Alcohol is not as fatal, but you can quote chapter and verse, example after example, where it has been fatal. But I think the matter is seized at the present time with the Standing Committee and hopefully with the Minister of Health to look at new and innovative ways in which to control that particular substance.
Abdu Conte.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in this very topic because back home in the Gambia, we've just enacted the Tobacco Control Act in 2001. But then we have difficulties in terms of implementing it, and up to now, there's public smoking. Tobacco is sold at retail shops in the Gambia. That we are finding it difficult to actually implement it. But I know I was even present at a meeting organized by the Ministry of Health, because I work for an NGO, a non-profit organization that delivers health promotion activities in the Gambia. So they were invited, and the tobacco companies came. They were not happy with the act. They said they were supposed to be involved, even though they have tried to kill or cut the process at some point, but they did not succeed in doing that. So they even left the meeting abruptly, in a very rude way, so to speak. But my question would be, Canada has done pretty well in terms of even getting the act enacted and legislated, which is very good. And when we walk around, we understand that there are places where you can't smoke. In fact, you hardly see a place where they will say it's smoke-free. And you can't also smoke inside the buildings and so on. These are very good. People are complying with them. At some point, I was even worried about yourself because you gave us a rundown of how you went about following that process. And at some point, you feel intimidated. You feel that you are doing something important, but at some point there are challenges along the line. It was a very rough road. I was even worried about your life. Have you ever experienced any form of attempt by, maybe indirectly, by the tobacco companies trying to use people to, your personal security, your personal safety? Have you ever encountered any of those threats in the process? Secondly, does Canada have plans to, at some point, completely ban the importation and smuggling of tobacco products to Canada? I know this is huge. It may sound utopian, but I think you have achieved a lot, and maybe with time, something like that might happen. Thank you.
Abdu, is it? Abdu. Excellent questions. In terms of, I'll take the second one first. In terms of the smuggling, the major operation of the smuggling regime in Canada during my time was in the Cornwall area. There was a lot of tobacco, which was cigarettes, which were coming in from a variety of sources. And the RCMP, I remember meeting with the Commissioner Murray, and talking about this, and we didn't have a specific piece of legislation. We strengthened some of the existing regulations, but what we were able to do is to achieve and to secure a pot of money for extra patrol, extra uniform police officers undercover in order to try to jam down that particular access point that was coming into Canada. And we were aided and abetted, if you will, in that process by the unions who worked with us, because they knew what was happening, what wasn't happening, and they were very, very helpful in terms of putting the resources to good use. So we were able, through the courts, because there were some significant charges which were laid, not to shut it down, but to deter it by, I would say, as high as 90%. And they have remained vigilant ever since in terms of the importation of tobacco products and illegal cigarettes. With regards to your first questions in terms of the challenges of either my personal safety or whatever, I never found that to be a challenge. We're quite fortunate in Canada to have a federation. The provinces have done an enormous deal of good work, and I think many of them don't get the credit that they deserve. I mean, the Dexter government in Nova Scotia did quite well in terms of trying to lessen tobacco consumption. Our municipalities have done an even better job. Some of our institutions, such as DAL and other universities, have put restrictions in place in terms of the smoker, because it's no longer cool to smoke. So we had those added advantages. The only thing I can say in terms of me is that there was a couple of people who followed me around for a period of time trying to catch me in a situation where I might be smoking a cigar. I was known at the time that if I was given a good cigar, I might smoke it. So the tobacco industry was quite anxious to get a photograph of that, but they never got that photograph. Thank God. As an aside, the night my legislation passed in the House of Commons,
Oh, no.
I was sitting next to Lloyd Axworthy, seniority. And it's tradition in the House of Commons, nothing to do with David Dingwall. But when you pass a bill, you stand up and you nod to the Speaker, and all members in the House clap. So I stood up and I clapped. And as I was clapping, a note was placed on my desk. And I looked at the note, and it said, "Open your desk." So I opened the desk, and it was full of cigars. And I'm trying to cover it up because the gallery is full of healthcare professionals. I never smoke them, I can assure you. Sorry.
Okay. So, David, let me just extend a little bit on this point about the comparative element to this. Because when we go abroad, so this is, I know, an issue that's close to your heart, and you travel a lot, you're in different countries for different reasons, but you note this issue about smoking. If you go to China, Mediterranean countries, the French, they seem to smoke a lot more than we do. So what explains I'm wondering, is this a question of culture, or is it a question of governance? To what extent is this about a governance, our ability to manage this issue compared to some of these other countries? Or do you have any kind of observations about why is it so different in other parts of the world that they're not able to, that they're coming to Canada for advice, and can we provide the advice that would help them?
Well, strategically, in Canada, the tobacco companies always spewed out the reference that this is part of our culture. You know, you go to Montreal and go to Quebec City, and, you know, in the Maritimes, the fishermen, everybody likes to have their cigarette, et cetera, et cetera. It was a falsehood, but nevertheless, it had legs. And tobacco saw this, and then they decided, well, we better start buying some of our cultural groups by giving sponsorships, billboards, the Du Maurier Center, you name it. And they would write the big checks because they had that $432 million that they could write a lot of checks on. And it was a myth. And we had to deal with that myth in Canada, but it's the same myth that is in Paris. It's the same myth that exists in China that is being promoted by big tobacco. In 2002, 2003, I did a study for the Pan American Health Organization on various countries in Latin America who had the problem of big tobacco. And it was very, very similar to what was transpiring in Canada. In fact, the Jimmy Carter Institute, which promoted good health around the world, got individuals somehow became associated with that great institute who wrote papers saying that, well, you know, I'm not sure tobacco legislation is necessary. We don't, you know, it's cultural. People have a culture, and they will decide for themselves. Freedom of choice. And it just proliferated. However, because of technology improvements, because of social media, and a host of other things, people now around the world realize completely the impact that tobacco consumption has on individuals, the secondary smoke. So more information is out there. And I think they can look to Canada to provide guidance. Parts of the United States can provide guidance. Australia, New Zealand, other countries in the world, they can look to and say, hey, well, they've done it. Perhaps we should do it because our healthcare costs are just going right through the roof. I hope that tries to answer a little bit of it.
One follow-up, slightly different angle on industry side. I remember at the time there were one of the arguments that came forward with great force was there'll never be another sporting event again in Canada because there'll be no sponsorship money for it. Did you ever worry that that might be true?
Well, when you're sitting down with your prime minister and your Quebec colleagues, and they're telling you that, look, you know, you're going to kill the sporting world. We're going to lose the Formula One. We're going to lose all of our theaters are going to close down, and you're the reason because you got that stupid piece of legislation going forward. And I indicated, I said, I think there's enough money in the pot that we can assist these sporting institutions and the various groups across the country that want to have their concerts done. But yeah, it was a pretty tough pill for them to swallow, and I give them kudos for standing on the side of good health. What we did is we went right into their backyard and said, okay, minister, this is what you're saying. So you're going to say to your daughter and your grandchildren, consume the smoke because you want to have the play at Neptune playing. Is that what you want? And in most instances, they got the drift and they backed off. But it was tough at the time.
Ashley Tingley?
Hey there. Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was pretty informative, very interesting. You mentioned briefly about the opposition amongst your colleagues of elected officials, like, if I remember correctly, how the bloc was opposed because the tobacco companies supported the arts, if I understood. Maybe you can give a little bit more insight to other reasons for your colleagues to have opposed the bill.
Well, you know, there's an old adage that only politicians would understand. But when you're sitting in the seat and you're looking across the aisle and you see this and you see this and you see this, sometimes the greatest opposition to your initiative is behind you. And we had a group of ministers in Quebec who were being lobbied, who were being lied to. Money was being spent on by the big tobacco in terms of what was going to transpire. They were going to lose the Formula One. The Montreal Forum was going to close. All of the festivals in Quebec would never come back again. So we had to try to counteract that. Madame Cops made sure that I heard those voices loud and clear, and we attempted to try to get some money together, whether we funneled it out through the ECOAs or the Quebec Economic Development to assist those various groups. We worked pretty hard and we were reasonably successful. But there was no question that big tobacco was just twisting. The other thing that they did, and they did very well, was they were hoping for delay. He's rushing this legislation. Well, that wasn't true, because I took the advice of the old master himself. I met with big tobacco. Now, they weren't very nice meetings. I don't think they'd ever invite me back to another gathering, but I had discussions with them, because I didn't want them to say to the Canadian public, he never consulted us. And we did consult those. But there was also this pitch, you're going too fast, you're going too fast. We don't understand the regulations, we don't understand the meat and substance of the act, which was just BS. So those two factors were at play, and we tried to wrestle with them as best we can. Little aside, tobacco legislation is passed in the House of Commons. I go to Montreal for a meeting as it relates to AIDS. I don't know if you know where Crescent Street is, but there's a little restaurant there called Churchill's. You go down underneath, they serve great soup. I couldn't get anybody to wait on me. They walked right by 4 or 5 times. So finally my assistant who was with me, she had to grab somebody and say, are we going to get soup? You'll get soup. So that's how mean-spirited it was in some of those regions of the country. I hope that answers.
Jared Sitley.
Thank you. What, in your opinion, are the next steps that the Canadian government of today, as it works towards the prohibition of tobacco, whether it be through taxation or legislation, should take in order to guard against the rise of the black market?
Well, I think we're doing a pretty effective job now with RCMP and National Police Forces. Is it perfect? No. Perhaps a few more investments along the way would be helpful in terms of that black market. Secondly is that I think the sanctions may have to be revisited. As you know, in Canadian law, you have a summary conviction offense, you have an indictable offense. I think they might want to revisit those to make sure that they're sufficiently tough that if anybody is caught in terms of the black market as it relates to cigarettes, they're going to be severely dealt with the law. So those would be two things that would come to my mind in terms of the black market. But I think we're doing a pretty effective job across the country at this point in time. Are there isolated examples? Yes, there is.
I'm going to insert myself for another question about marijuana and cannabis. Are these totally different issues? And the reason I ask is some people say from Health Canada that we've been working on this anti-tobacco message for 20 years, and now we have to accommodate legalizing cannabis, and it seems there's a tension. Are they different issues, or is there a tension that has to be managed?
Oh, I think there are different issues, but there are a lot of similarities. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, I know next week when you have this symposium with the Chancellor, a former Minister of Health, I mean, she'll probably give out samples at that meeting, and she'll have a great crowd that will show up. But there are similarities, and in fact, I give full credit to the Government of Canada. There's two bills, mind you. There's Bill 45 and Bill 46. One deals with the impairment provisions that police officers will have to execute throughout the country. We have a young MP here in Nova Scotia, Fraser from Southwest Nova, who's a lawyer and a criminal lawyer. He's doing yeoman service on that committee in terms of perfecting the law, which will be administered by a senior officials. The marijuana legislation has adopted significant parts of the tobacco legislation, just lifted it right off of the page in terms of the advertising, in terms of its contents, in terms of quality, et cetera, which I think is pretty smart and pretty good. And of course, its overall feature is to try to take the criminal element out of the marijuana business and make certain that the quality of the product in young people are protected. Whereas as today, without that legislation, they're not protected. And as a health minister, one has to be seized with that objective to making sure that product on the market is going to be a quality product and is not going to cause injury to our citizens. And also the provisions within the Act to provide a lot of financial assistance to educate people on the shortcomings of consumption of marijuana, I think is pretty significant and a pretty bold piece of legislation that the Government of Canada has put forward. But there's a lot of similarities, yes.
Please go ahead. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Shaw. I'm an MPA student. So one of the most commendable things of the Tobacco Act was its effect on youth, and I definitely agree with that. Being somebody from the global developing world, being here, I haven't seen positive advertising for tobacco for a long time. But my question is that as there are more closer substitutes to cigarettes coming around, like other than marijuana, shisha and e-cigarettes, which are much more vibrant. So for example, I come from Calgary, Alberta. There's a shisha corner. There's a shisha place pretty much around every corner, and shisha does induce tobacco. For me, myself, that's something that I found out much later. So there isn't that much information out of it. So my question is that do you feel like it's time to extend the legislation, like the tobacco legislation, to stop or slow down the growing trend of shisha or e-cigarettes?
The short answer is yes. I think a number of the provinces in the Government of Canada are working on that. Some provinces have passed legislation as it relates to vaporized cigarettes. The issue there is the nicotine content of that e-cigarette. That's a key ingredient. If there's no nicotine, fine. Secondly is that we need to be innovative and creative to help that group of Canadians who are smoking and want to get off smoking. Yes, sometimes gum works. Sometimes the patch will work. but it's probably not enough. So we need some alternatives to get them off the tobacco. I don't like the e-cigarettes with the nicotine. I'm not a fan of that. But if you had other substitutes which would not prolong the continuous use of tobacco, I think it's good. And I think we need to be creative, we need to be open-minded so that we can help those Canadians that really want to get off tobacco. That 45 to 65-year-old, the only time they will quit smoking is when they have the heart attack and they're in recovery. Get rid of my cigarettes. We don't want to go that route. But we need measures to assist them. And I think it's dicey, but we need to be innovative and creative.
Sorry, I just meant that, would you feel that you need to research this campaign that you did pretty much for tobacco for youth to be revamped again? For example, shisha and e-cigarettes is cool, right? People do it for social events. And I understand that your argument that the content of nicotine matters, but it's also the duration of it as well. So for example, shisha can have a very low quantity of cigarette per dose, but people do it for hours. They will sit there for 4 hours smoking shisha. So
Well, I'd be against it as a former Minister of Health and someone involved with public policy. But if you're telling me that there is an e-cigarette out there with no nicotine, and you're just blowing air and it's helping the individual to get off, that's fine. Young lady here.
Thanks. Kalinda, I'm also an MPA student. And I just want to go back to the gray market for a moment and talk about First Nations, where it actually is a cultural practice to use tobacco, although not in the form of cigarettes. But it has become a moneymaker for some First Nations entrepreneurs living on reserve who have started making their own cigarettes and selling them. And I'm just interested, especially in the context of your book about negotiating, what do you think the government should try to negotiate to stop that practice? And especially in terms of tobacco farmers who are looking for alternative crops, but they don't want to lose the very valuable crop that they've been harvesting for so long.
Probably three things. On the farmer side, you can buy them out. We bought them out on the other side in terms of the tobacco, but in terms of their selling to the Aboriginals, is buy them out. It's like a buyback. Here's your 25,000. You're out. No one else can start. That's number one. Number two is that I think we have to engage our First Nations people in a serious dialogue in terms of the effect that smoking and tobacco has on their health, both short-term and long-term. And it's been my experience in terms of dealing with Aboriginals that that's a very, very important dialogue. That will not be resolved overnight. It will take a period of time in which to educate, and for them, elders, to educate others that, hey, this is a substance that's going to have an enormous impact on your life and the quality of life that you're going to have. If you visited First Nations, as I have, and you've gone to some of their palliative care units, their senior citizens units, you see the effects that tobacco have had over a long period of time. And I don't think Aboriginals, I think they're ready for that kind of discussion in which to go forward. And thirdly is that I don't think you can whip the Aboriginals peoples into a certain way. You have to engage them, and you have to bring them along, and you have to be honest with what you have in terms of the evidence that you're producing. I had a situation where I thought I had the answer. I walked into an Aboriginal community and they wanted a new arena. I said, you'll get the arena, but no smoking. They said, Minister, have a nice trip back to Ottawa. That was me. I made the mistake. I should have engaged first. I didn't engage. I had the answer. Those answers don't work with Aboriginal people. Hasn't been my experience.
Sir, go ahead, please. Actually, if you would wait for the mic, actually.
Mr. Dingwall, my name is Jim Meek. I'm a recovering political journalist. I now work as a public affairs consultant. I want to take you back to the cabinet talks, negotiations I'm always interested in where ministers of finance are on these issues, especially when the Minister of Finance was Paul Martin. They never liked to lose revenue streams. Tell us about how you brought him over, as it were, because I'm sure he wouldn't, well, I'm guessing he wouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, as you know, Minister Martin, and I want to be fair to him, I think it would be uncouth if I was not fair to him, but you need to know that Minister Martin was a former board member of R.J. McDonald, Big Tobacco, and I understand he was an excellent board member at R.J. McDonald. But when he became Minister of Finance, of course, he had to relinquish his obligations to R.J. McDonald. The fight at Cabinet came down between Martin and myself, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and the Minister of Treasury Board, which was Marcel Mass. I wanted millions, not thousands, I wanted millions of dollars for educational purposes. And when I didn't see that forthcoming, I wouldn't leave the Cabinet table. And I wouldn't allow the chair to call the meeting to an end. And so I was ushered outside at a break by the minister responsible for Treasury Board, Mr. Marcel Mass, and he said, "You can't be asking for all that money." I said, "I am. And I want it. And if it's not there, I'll tell the goddamn Canadian, I'll tell the Canadian people." We did pretty well. I didn't get everything that I asked for, but we got a large sum of money out of the Department of Finance for educational programs. Now, whether Paul Martin was behind that or not, I don't think he was, because it was a big expenditure on a yearly basis that we were going to be making to the Canadian people, particularly directing it at youth in terms of advertising going forward. But that, again, was another example of, who's behind you.
I'm going to ask one other question, and I'll come back to you, Kinner, in a sec. Another course the students take in the MPA program is organizational design, and they think a little bit about how we organize our structures. So beyond the cabinet room, when we go back to the House of Commons for a second, I wonder if you might speculate, if we had a form of proportional representation at this time, do you think we'd have the Tobacco Act?
Probably not. I know the people who are promoting this proportional representation, but, it's a crock from my perspective, If you want to run for Parliament, have the intestinal fortitude, put your name on the ballot, run for the political party of your choice and move on. I don't want to be holding, under a proportional representation system, to some person in Halifax who's going to say whether or not I can run in Cape Breton or not run in Cape Breton. And that's what proportional representation does. It gives you a new bureaucracy who are going to say to the political class, "We know what is best. You're not good enough to run. You're only 27. You only have a law degree. You're not good enough. We're going to go with someone much older." So I'm not a big fan of proportional representations. And those that promote it, most of them, with the exception of a few, I think Ed Broadbent is one of the big promoters of it, but most of them don't hold elective office. Could I be any clearer?
No, on the tobacco issue of negotiation, what kind of skills do you think you would have required on the point of negotiation? Or would it just be a non-starter? It would have been a non-starter in proportional representation?
No, I mean, you have to deal with the deck of cards that are there, so you have to size up your stakeholders and, give you an example. Lynn McDonald was an NDP member who introduced this private members bill. I mean, she's done great service on the tobacco legislation. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, I get all the credit for the 1997 Act because it was a new act and it was confirmed by Parliament. But there's a hell of a lot of people that came before me. Jake Epp of the NDP, Liz McDonald, or McDonald? Lynn. Yeah, Lynn McDonald. I mean, fantastic contributions that they had made in terms of moving this legislation along. The kinds of skills, you got to listen, you got to understand what the interests are behind those. If the interests behind what they're saying is to delay, is to water down, that's a different story. If the interest is to improve, is to embellish, move the yardstick up a little bit, yes, take it on. It's very good, very positive. You move it along.
Okay, we'll maybe go back for one here and one there, okay? And then we'll wrap, I think.
Hi. So listening to you talk about your work as a minister, it reminded me of something we've been studying in one of my political science classes, is the concentration of power in the PMO's office, so far less independence for ministers. And I was wondering, there's been a lot of criticism of that, saying that it's detrimental to our democratic process, the fact that there's increasing power concentrated with the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. I was wondering if you agree with such criticisms.
I think, now that I've left public life, I have no aspirations to return to public life. And when you look at it from afar, there does appear to be an over-concentration of power in the hands of a few and not the many. On the other side, it takes an individual who's duly elected to exercise their judgment and their intestinal fortitude, if they believe in something strongly, to state it. And when is the last time we had a person in the Parliament of Canada who stepped aside because of principle? It doesn't happen very often anymore. So there is an obligation on that sitting MP to stand for what they believe in order to effectuate what I would call the public good. But to your general statement, concentration of power, I think that's fairly accurate.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Reza, and I'm MPA student, and I'm going to read my question to you. Have you ever tried to pass a law for price regulation on tobacco, and how much do you think it would affect the consumption to set a high minimum price for cigarettes?
Well, the price of cigarettes today, fairly high, fairly expensive. That was one part of our strategy way back in the day, is to increase that price in order to push down the demand for the product. The problem that we encountered at that time is that we had illegal cigarettes. So it becomes a judgment call, it becomes a balancing issue. And I think you need to take advice, as I did, from the Commissioner of the RCMP in terms of what that will mean. In today's age, if you increase that price of cigarettes, people will complain, whether it's provincially or federally, but I think you need to have a sizable amount of that increase. It's given to law enforcement to make sure that it doesn't come through the back door. And I think some years we've been a little bit reluctant to give more money to law enforcement in order to carry that out, to preclude the black market getting a foothold. Because once they get a foothold, it's very difficult to take it away.
From here, Mr. Dingwall will go down to the MacEachen Institute, where he will join some second years in a roundtable discussion of his new book on negotiation. At that time, I'll offer him a token of our appreciation on your behalf. Please join me in thanking David Dingwall for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you.